Ilhan Omar's favorite defense was never a clean document, a consistent timeline, or a straight answer. It was accusation wrapped in moral superiority. For years, every serious question about her marriage history was treated as hatred before it was treated as contradiction. Journalists retreated, investigators were smeared, and citizens were told that noticing the holes was somehow worse than the holes themselves. That strategy worked because Washington fears labels more than it respects records, and Omar understood that weakness. She did not settle the issue with paperwork. She trained the system to feel guilty for asking to see it. That is the first political conflict in this story, and it is larger than one congresswoman or one disputed marriage. It is a collision between identity politics and documentary scrutiny, between emotional intimidation and the expectation that public officials answer public questions. Omar's allies called the inquiry a partisan ambush, while her critics saw a protected politician hiding behind institutions meant to examine her. The press, terrified of being branded bigoted, often behaved less like a watchdog than a nervous public relations team. By the time Senator John Kennedy entered the hearing, the issue was also why so many powerful people had discouraged anyone from looking. Omar opened like a seasoned operator, not by resolving the contradiction, but by redefining the room before questions began. She presented herself as the target of an attack on a Muslim woman, a black woman, and a refugee, placing every question under moral suspicion. It was effective because it forced viewers to choose emotionally before they were allowed to evaluate anything factually. Her posture was controlled, her voice was steady, and her message was aimed at the cameras rather than Kennedy. She needed the audience to believe the hearing itself was the scandal, because that framing had protected her for years. Kennedy did not interrupt, because interruption would have given Omar proof that the proceeding was hostile, theatrical, and personal. He waited while she built the wall, then opened the folder, threatening to expose how little concrete support stood behind it. His method was not loud, but it was disciplined, and discipline is dangerous when the other side relies on outrage. He began with the timeline, asking about the 2009 legal marriage to Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi and the earlier faith marriage to Ahmed Hirsi. Omar answered quickly, with the speed of someone stepping onto familiar ground where rehearsed explanations had already been tested. Then, Kennedy moved to the tax filings, where slogans about identity could not rewrite dates, signatures, or legal status. While Omar was still legally married to Elmi, she had filed joint federal tax returns with Hirsi, the man she said she had separated from. Omar emphasized that the filings were corrected and that she had cooperated, but Kennedy's point was narrower and more damaging. The correction came after the discrepancy was identified, making voluntarily sound less like transparency and more like cleanup. She shifted toward the complexity of immigrant and faith-based marriages, but complexity does not erase a federal filing. The hearing split into two languages. Omar spoke of lived experience and moral injury, while Kennedy spoke of names, years, filings, and contradictions. She appealed to culture, immigration, privacy, and the character of the questioner, because those were the fields where her instincts were strongest. Kennedy kept narrowing the discussion, forcing the audience to compare a sweeping grievance with a specific record, still requiring an answer. When he asked what relationship Elmi had to her, Omar returned to the shield that had punished critics for years, calling the allegation disgusting and Islamophobic. Kennedy exposed the weakness in that defense. Condemning a question is not the same as disproving what it asks. The Star Tribune complicated her position because it was not a fringe blog, but her own hometown newspaper. Its investigation said it could neither conclusively confirm nor rebut the allegation, which did not prove the claim, but destroyed the idea that only extremists considered it unresolved. Kennedy then introduced the 2012 caption in which an account associated with Elmi allegedly called Omar's newborn child a niece, another detail she tried to dismiss through culture and context. Each item could be challenged alone, but together They narrowed the space for the old defense and made every new document more dangerous. And Kennedy had not yet reached the campaign money, the third marriage, or the federal form deeper in the folder, where the political argument was about to become far darker. Kennedy shifted from the disputed family relationship to the one subject Ilhan Omar could not dismiss as private emotion: campaign money. Her campaign had paid more than $3 million to E Street Group, the consulting firm owned by Tim Minette, the man who later became her husband. Omar called the services legitimate, professional, competitive, and transparent, stacking respectable words around a transaction that still demanded scrutiny. The problem was not that campaigns hire consultants, or that politicians form relationships, but that public money, political influence, and personal intimacy had converged inside the same arrangement. Kennedy did not need to accuse her of romance for profit. The financial records had already made the relationship politically radioactive. During the same period those payments were being made, Omar's relationship with Minette allegedly moved beyond professional boundaries. Dr. Beth Jordan Minette filed for divorce in August 2019 and stated under oath that her husband had told her he was leaving the marriage for Omar. Omar refused to discuss another person's divorce proceedings, a convenient appeal to privacy that ignored why the sworn filing mattered. Kennedy did not chase the personal scandal because his stronger argument was sitting in the campaign ledger. The romance was private, but the millions transferred from a campaign account to the romantic partner's company were not. That distinction stripped Omar of the safest defense available to her. She could describe love as complicated, relationships as human, and divorce as painful, but federal campaign disbursements do not become private because the recipients share a bedroom. Kennedy kept the money on the public side of the boundary, where filings, vendors, dates, and totals could be reviewed without asking permission from anyone's personal life. Omar wanted the committee to see a woman being humiliated over relationships. Kennedy wanted the audience to see a politician demanding privacy while spending donor money through a company tied to the man at the center of those relationships. He then arranged the three marriages as a single political pattern rather than three unrelated episodes. The first involved Ahmed Hirsi, a faith marriage without a legal record, followed by joint tax filings made while Omar was legally married to another man. The second involved Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi, the legal marriage surrounded by unresolved questions about family relationship and immigration status. The third involved Tim Minette, whose firm received millions from Omar's campaign before and after the relationship became public. Once those events were placed beside one another, the defense of isolated complexity became much harder to sustain. Omar reacted by calling the presentation outrageous, because outrage was the last tool capable of blurring the pattern Kennedy had assembled. She argued that these were real relationships involving real emotions, as though emotional reality could cancel financial documentation. Kennedy's answer was devastatingly simple. Characterizations do not contain dollar amounts, but FEC filings do. That sentence exposed the entire weakness in her strategy, because she kept answering arithmetic with biography. The committee was not being asked to judge whether her feelings were genuine. It was being asked to examine why every relationship seemed accompanied by a legal, tax, immigration, or campaign transaction. The more Omar raised her voice, the more Kennedy lowered his, and the contrast made her performance look increasingly unstable. She attempted to turn scrutiny into cruelty, but the records remained unchanged by the emotional temperature of the room. $3 million did not shrink because she felt insulted, and conflicting tax filings did not become culturally harmless because the questioning felt invasive. Kennedy's restraint was politically effective because it denied Omar the confrontation she needed to revive her victim narrative. He was not fighting her identity. He was forcing her to stand beside the documents she had spent years keeping outside the frame. Then came the phrase that compressed the entire pattern into something the audience could not easily forget. 3 marriages, 3 money trails. It was mocking, severe, and deliberately unflattering, but it grew directly from the sequence already displayed on the table. Immigration status appeared beside one marriage, disputed tax benefits beside another, and millions in campaign payments beside the third. Omar's defense required every transaction to be treated separately, surrounded by enough emotional context to prevent comparison. Kennedy's method was to remove that insulation and show the same electrical wire running through every wall. Her expression hardened, but hardness is not the same as rebuttal, and the room could feel the difference. For the first time, the old language about persecution seemed too distant from the concrete numbers in front of her. The opening speech had promised that she feared no question, yet each answer now depended on narrowing what the committee was supposedly allowed to examine. Privacy was invoked when the sworn divorce filing appeared, culture when the family terminology surfaced, and complexity when the tax filings were discussed. Every defense changed with the document, but none of them removed the underlying contradiction. Kennedy allowed the silence to widen before reaching beneath the folder for the final page. He handled it differently from the earlier exhibits, using both hands and placing it before him with unusual care. The gesture mattered because it told the room that the tax records, newspaper investigation, social media caption, divorce filing, and campaign payments had only been preparation. Omar had survived each earlier item by attacking interpretation, motive, context, and character. The last document, however, threatened to bypass interpretation and state the disputed relationship in the government's own language. For 8 years, Omar had insisted that no federal record connected her and Elmi as members of the same biological family. Kennedy now claimed the committee had obtained an immigration application from 1995 through a federal records subpoena, a form filed for family reunification and preserved inside the government's own archive. Omar's hands flattened against the table as Kennedy began reading the names listed inside the same family unit. But the most dangerous detail was not merely that both names appeared on the form. It was the relationship entered beside them in black ink. And when Kennedy reached that single box, Omar's entire political defense was about to be forced into a choice where either answer carried consequences far beyond the hearing room. Kennedy read the 1995 immigration form slowly, not because the names were difficult, but because speed would have given Ilhan Omar another place to hide. The application listed Omar and Ahmed Nur Said Elmi inside the same family unit, under the same petition, with the same bureaucratic precision that had been missing from every public denial. Then, Kennedy reached the relationship field and read the word that collapsed 8 years of moral intimidation into one federal entry: siblings. Omar had spent years treating the allegation as filth, yet the document in front of her did not sound like a blog, a partisan operative, or an anonymous account. It sounded like the government recording what her own family had allegedly submitted. Her first response was not an explanation, but distance. She said she had never seen the document and questioned whether it was authentic. Kennedy answered that Omar had been 12 when the form was filed, that it had been submitted by her father, and that it had been obtained from a federal records warehouse. That left her with a brutal choice, because attacking the record meant shifting suspicion toward the person who filed it. If the document was false, then someone in her family had allegedly placed false information on an immigration application signed under penalty of perjury. If the document was accurate, then Omar's years of public denial had just collided with the federal paper trail she said did not exist. Omar tried to retreat into the complexity of refugee resettlement, family designations, and records created decades earlier. The tactic was familiar because complexity had already been used to fog the tax filings. Culture had been used to soften the social media caption, and privacy had been used to block questions about campaign money. But this time, the ambiguity could not expand indefinitely, because Kennedy narrowed the issue to one direct question: was the sibling designation wrong? Omar began to answer, stopped, redirected, and then stopped again because every route led back to the same document. For a politician who had built her defense on controlling the moral vocabulary of the room, the inability to finish a sentence was more damaging than any insult Kennedy could have delivered. The silence that followed did not resemble restraint, dignity, or principled refusal. It looked like the moment when a carefully rehearsed political vocabulary reached the edge of its usefulness and found a government record sitting there. Omar could call Kennedy biased, accuse the hearing of persecution, or condemn the motives of everyone asking, but none of those moves could erase a relationship box already filled in. The word Islamophobia had been effective against people because people can be shamed, intimidated, professionally isolated, and frightened into retreat. A form cannot be shamed, and that was the imbalance Omar could no longer control. Her fingers moved toward her lower lip, while the room waited for the confident rebuttal promised in her opening statement. Nothing came except the narrow statement that she had nothing further to say at that time, the language of legal containment replacing the language of political defiance. Kennedy did not celebrate, because celebration would have cheapened the record and allowed Omar to portray the exchange as personal cruelty. Instead, he returned to the timeline and placed the dates beside one another with the patience of a prosecutor arranging exhibits. The effect was merciless because the pattern no longer depended on a single allegation. It depended on the accumulation of documents Omar had never successfully reconciled. The timeline began with the faith marriage to Ahmed Hirsi, then moved to the legal marriage to Elmi. The joint tax filings with Hirsi, while Omar remained legally married to Elmi, and the later divorce. It continued through the eventual legal marriage to Hirsi, the breakup connected to Tim Minette, and the millions paid from Omar's campaign to Minette's consulting firm. Kennedy then returned to the 1995 immigration form, the document that placed Omar and Elmi in the same household and identified them as siblings. 8 dates, 3 marriages, multiple financial transactions, and 1 federal record now stood in a line longer than any identity speech could cover. Omar had insisted for years that critics were manufacturing smoke, yet Kennedy's table was filling with paper. The political damage came from the contrast between how Omar entered the hearing and how she left the central exchange. She began with the confidence of a politician who believed the accusation against the questioner would always matter more than the answer. She looked toward the cameras, framed herself as the victim, and presented scrutiny as proof of the system's prejudice. By the time Kennedy finished, her audience was no longer being asked to choose between compassion and cruelty. It was being asked to choose between the politician's framing and the government record sitting in plain view. The clip spread because viewers recognized something Washington rarely allows them to see: a narrative losing control in real time. The short version captured Kennedy reading the family relationship and Omar falling silent, but the longer version showed why that silence mattered. It showed every previous defense being introduced, tested, and stripped of power as the hearing moved from emotion to documentation. The tax filings weakened the claim of harmless complexity. The newspaper investigation weakened the claim of fringe conspiracy, and the campaign payments weakened the claim that private relationships were nobody's business. The immigration form then arrived after every escape route had already been narrowed. According to the script's sequence, federal agencies began reviewing the immigration record while the House Ethics Committee examined the tax filings and campaign disbursements. Democratic allies did not rush forward with a detailed factual defense, and several Minnesota politicians released careful statements about accountability without placing Omar's name at the center. That silence carried its own political meaning, because loyal allies usually speak clearly when they believe a colleague can be defended cleanly. Vague language is what Washington uses when support has become expensive, but abandonment still feels dangerous. Omar had spent years forcing critics to retreat, and now members of her own political camp were beginning to create distance without admitting why. But the greater threat was not the viral clip, the mocking headlines, or even the immediate committee scrutiny. The real danger was the machinery behind the paper, the agencies, archived files, sworn submissions, payment records, and legal questions that do not disappear when the cameras turn away. Kennedy had opened one drawer, yet the document suggested there might be other drawers containing records created long before Omar became powerful enough to frighten people away from asking. And in the next stage, the scandal would move beyond one hearing and into the far colder territory where political loyalty, immigrant credibility, and federal exposure begin colliding with each other. The political class did not discover courage after Kennedy opened the drawer. It discovered distance, Washington's safest currency when a scandal becomes expensive. Omar's allies began speaking in abstractions about accountability and process, language designed to sound principled, without touching the actual record. They avoided repeating that every question was bigotry, because the federal form had made that defense look reckless. They also avoided explaining the tax filings, campaign payments, or relationship timeline. They stepped backward and hoped voters would mistake retreat for restraint, while quietly preparing for the possibility that the machinery they once dismissed would continue moving without them. That retreat exposed the factional conflict surrounding Omar because her protection never depended only on personal loyalty. She represented a coalition built around identity politics, activist media, and institutional fear of appearing hostile to refugees or Muslim Americans. For years, that coalition treated scrutiny of Omar as an attack on the entire group, forcing critics to choose between silence and punishment. Kennedy broke the arrangement by separating the politician from the paper and asking whether the record was true. Once the issue became documentary, rather than symbolic, the coalition had no clean defense left. The viral clip mattered because millions recognized the tactic, even if they had never followed Omar's marriage history. They had watched institutions change the subject when questions became dangerous, and politicians attack motives instead of answering. Omar's silence became a symbol of that larger system failing under pressure. The clip did not spread merely because Kennedy embarrassed a congresswoman. It spread because a protected narrative appeared to lose its immunity. Viewers saw a question finally survive the accusation attached to it. The reaction among legal immigrants was especially damaging because the script framed the dispute as an insult to people who followed every rule. They know the cost of forms, interviews, fees, delays, and the fear that one inconsistency can destroy years of work. Federal paperwork is not an abstraction to them. It is a gate that opens only after complete submission. Watching Omar dismiss contradictions as cultural complexity could sound less like compassion than political privilege. The resentment came from believing ordinary applicants face consequences powerful figures can postpone. Kennedy's strength was that he never needed to become louder than Omar. He allowed the documents to carry the aggression, making every attempt to redirect the exchange look weaker. A shouting match could have rescued her by turning the hearing into partisan theater, but a timeline denied her that escape. Each date narrowed the argument, each filing reduced the fog, and each number moved the dispute away from moral performance. By the end, Kennedy looked less like an opponent than a clerk reading back what the system had preserved. The Federal Review, described in the script, raised the stakes because bureaucracy operates differently from television. Television rewards speed, outrage, emotional certainty, and domination of a moment, while investigations reward records, consistency, sworn statements, and patience. Omar had mastered the first arena, but the second offered fewer opportunities for moral framing. Agencies do not need to win an argument before requesting documents. They need enough cause to open a file, and an open file can outlive any news cycle, every sympathetic interview, and every carefully rehearsed attempt to redefine scrutiny as persecution. The House Ethics Inquiry into tax filings and campaign disbursements added another front. Omar could argue that relationships were private, but campaign money remained governed by public rules and donor expectations. She could call the consulting work legitimate, yet the scale and timing of payments still demanded scrutiny. The central question was whether political money and personal benefit had become too closely intertwined. That question could not be erased by attacking Kennedy's tone, because the filings existed independently of him. The most damaging transformation was Omar's movement from accuser to subject. At the beginning, she controlled the moral hierarchy, assigning guilt to anyone who questioned her, and presenting herself as injured before evidence appeared. By the end, she was responding to a record she said she had never seen, while her language narrowed from sweeping accusation to legal caution. The institutions that protected the fog were exposed as timid, and Kennedy's folder became an indictment of their cowardice as much as of Omar's evasions, their years of silence, and their calculated refusal to test rhetoric against records. The system she had learned to intimidate had kept the receipts, and once somebody finally read them aloud on live television, silence